The archive is open. Come in out of the cold, your chair is where you left it, the one by the lamp. Tonight I've pulled something from the lake shelves. The lighthouse, keepers of Lake Superior, and the long, repeated work behind a light that sailors learned to trust. You don't need to remember any of this. There's no test at the end. If you drift, I'll keep reading. Let's begin. Start with the beam. Far out on Lake Superior, it appeared as a measured flash against the dark. A sailor did not need to see the tower, the house beside it, or the rocky point beneath it. The light itself was enough. Its color, its interval, and its place on the horizon could identify a station as clearly as a name written on a chart. From the water, that beam could seem almost automatic. It arrived, disappeared, and returned. 10 seconds might pass. Then the same white stroke crossed the lake again, steady enough to steer by. The tower stood still, and the light kept its appointment. But the lighthouse did not keep itself. Before electric lamps, compact motors, and automated controls, every dependable flash rested on a chain of ordinary tasks. Fuel had to be carried and stored. A lamp had to be filled, pressurized, or trimmed according to its design. Glass had to be cleaned because a trace of soot could weaken the signal. Clockwork had to be wound. Bearings, pumps, tools, and fog machinery required attention. Weather and station business went into a daily log. Paint protected exposed wood and metal. Boats, paths, roofs, and living quarters all belonged to the same working place. The tower was only the part a passing vessel could see. Around it stood the rest of the system. A keeper's dwelling, perhaps another house for assistants, an oil room, a fog signal building, a boat landing, sheds, cisterns, gardens, fences, and the cleared ground that kept trees from hiding the light. Some stations occupied mainland cliffs. Others stood on islands reached only by boat. Staffing, equipment, and seasons differed from place to place, but the central bargain was the same. When darkness or poor visibility covered the lake, the station had to answer in the way mariners expected. That expectation turned maintenance into a public promise. Success was usually uneventful. A lamp burned at the proper brightness. A mechanism turned at the proper speed. A fog signal sounded its assigned pattern, and a vessel altered course without anyone ashore knowing its name. The best result of all that labor was often that nothing unusual happened, leaving only a short line in the station log before the next day's work began. The people who kept it were not always solitary men living beyond the edge of society. A principal keeper might work beside one or more assistants. Spouses and children often lived at the station, at least for part of the year. They cooked, washed, tended gardens, kept households, helped with lamps, watched weather, and managed the practical complications of school and supplies. Some women received official appointments and pay. Much other family work remained informal, necessary, and less visible in the records. On Lake Superior, distance made that household labor especially plain. A station family could not step out for a missing tool or a sack of flour. Supplies arrived by tender or small boat, sometimes after weather had delayed them. At exposed stations, a trip to shore had to wait for the lake to permit it. Even a quiet evening depended on stores counted earlier, repairs completed in daylight, and machinery left ready for the next watch. This is the history we will follow tonight. Not a catalogue of storms and not a procession of towers viewed from far away. We will move through the station itself, into the lantern room, down beside the clockwork, across to the fog signal building, through the keeper's log, and back to the house where another part of the work continued. The beam will return throughout the night, but we will spend our time with the hands that made it return. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. In the late afternoon, before the lamp was lit, a keeper could climb the tower with a brass key in one hand. The lens above was still dark. Beyond the glass, Lake Superior stretched toward the horizon, giving no sign that it required anything from the small rooms on shore. Then the key turned, the lantern room opened, and the day's careful preparation began. Before a lighthouse could be built, someone had to decide where the darkness caused the most trouble. Lake Superior offered many answers. Its shore bent around long bays and projected into rocky points. Islands divided open water into channels. Reefs waited below the surface. Harbors that looked broad on a map could narrow to a careful entrance when approached by a loaded vessel. A light placed in one location might guide ships along a coast. Another marked a turn. Another warned that what looked like open water was not open at all. The system grew with traffic. During the 19th century, steamships, passenger vessels, and freighters moved between the lake ports with increasing regularity. Copper, iron ore, grain, timber, coal, machinery, mail, and people all traveled over the water. A captain familiar with the coast still needed fixed points, especially when night or haze removed the familiar shape of the land. So lighthouse planning began with geography and habit. Officials considered the routes vessels already used, the places where those routes changed direction, and the stretches where a reliable mark was missing. They studied charts, listened to mariners, requested money from Congress, surveyed sites, and then waited through the slow federal process that stood between a recommendation and a working lamp. In the Apostle Islands, Raspberry Island stood beside the West Channel used by steamboats. Its light was first shown in 1863. The station did not need to explain the whole archipelago. It had one clear task: give vessels a dependable mark as they passed among islands whose dark outlines could merge with one another after sunset. Farther east on Michigan's South Shore, Osable Point presented a different problem. The light station built there in 1873 and 1874 occupied an exposed point west of Grand Marais. Its tower rose 86 feet, with foundations carried deep into the bedrock. From the lake, the fixed white light gave mariners a known position along a coast where the next safe course depended on knowing precisely which point lay ahead. Near Isle Royale, the useful waterway became narrow. Passage Island Light marked the route between Passage Island and the northeastern end of Isle Royale, a corridor only 3¼ miles wide. Ships traveling between the lower lakes and Thunder Bay used it as a direct passage. The first light there, activated in 1882, showed fixed red. Later it became flashing white. The change mattered because a lighthouse was not merely brightness. Each station needed a recognizable identity. That identity was called its characteristic. One light might remain fixed while another flashed. Colors and intervals differed. On a dark lake, these patterns worked like names spoken slowly across the water. A mariner could time a flash, compare it with the chart or light list, and decide not only that land was near, but which piece of land it was. Split rock came later. In the early 20th century, iron ore shipments increased sharply along Minnesota's North Shore. After a 1905 gale damaged many vessels, Congress approved money for a lighthouse and fog signal near Split Rock. Construction began on a cliff reached by water, and the new light entered service in 1910. Its position answered a route that had become busier before the shore had become easier to read. The towers that resulted did not follow one shape. Some lights rose from houses, others stood apart from the keepers' quarters. Height depended partly on the land beneath them. A low tower on a high cliff could place its lamp above the horizon, while a taller tower might be needed on lower ground. The goal was not to build the most impressive object. It was to put a specific signal where it could be seen from the water that required it. Once the site was chosen, the decision changed ordinary life on shore. A survey line became a tower. A remote landing began receiving fuel and provisions. Keepers and families moved into houses built around the needs of shipping. The chart gained a mark, and the dark acquired an interval. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Picture a folded lake chart on a wooden table, held flat at the corners by a ruler, an ink bottle, a brass divider, and one smooth stone. Along the shore are small marks where the lights will stand. Each mark is quiet on paper. Out on the water, each one will become a place a sailor can recognize in the dark. A lighthouse lens did not create light. It persuaded more of the light already present to travel in a useful direction. That distinction matters. A bare flame shines outward in nearly every direction. Some light reaches the horizon, but much of it rises toward the ceiling, falls toward the floor, or spreads through the lantern room where no distant vessel can use it. The keeper could burn more fuel and make a larger flame, but without good optics, much of that effort would still be lost. The Fresnel lens changed the arrangement. Developed in France by Augustin-Jean Fresnel in the early 19th century, it divided the curved surface of a thick lens into rings. Each ring bent or reflected part of the light toward the same general path. The result looked less like one smooth piece of glass than a tall, careful assembly of prisms fitted around a central lamp. Removing the unnecessary thickness made a large lens more practical. Instead of one immense solid curve, the optic could be assembled from comparatively slender elements held at exact angles. It was still heavy and costly, but it could gather light across a broad surface without becoming an almost solid mass of glass. From nearby, the lens could resemble a room made of glass. Its panels rose above the keeper, held by a brass frame, with every prism cut for a particular place. The flame inside remained modest. The surrounding glass gathered its scattered rays and sent them outward as a concentrated beam. Lenses were classified by order. A first-order lens was among the largest, suited to major coastal stations. Higher numbered orders were progressively smaller. Lake Superior stations used different sizes according to their purpose and required range. Passage Island began with a fourth-order lens and an oil-burning wick lamp. Split Rock received a much larger third-order bivalve lens when it entered service in 1910. Bivalve simply meant that the strongest portions of the lens formed two great faces, a little like two opposing shells. As the assembly turned, Each face sent a beam across the horizon. A mariner saw a flash, then darkness, then the flash returned after the mechanism completed its measured rotation. At Split Rock, the complete optic weighed about 1,500 pounds. It rested on a bearing containing 250 pounds of mercury. The heavy lens could turn with remarkably little friction, driven by clockwork beneath it. A governor controlled the speed, producing one flash every 10 seconds. The machinery below translated falling weight into rotation. A cable wound around the mechanism supported a column of metal discs inside the tower's central mast. Gravity pulled the weights downward. Gears converted that slow descent into the smooth horizontal movement of the lens. About every 2 hours through the night, the cable had to be wound again, raising the weights so they could continue their patient fall. At the center, Split Rock used an incandescent oil vapor lamp. Kerosene held in a brass tank was placed under air pressure by hand. The fuel passed toward the burner, where heat changed it into vapor before combustion. The bright mantle and flame remained still while the great glass assembly moved around them. This system was efficient, precise, and entirely dependent on care. Dust dulled glass. Soot intercepted light. A poorly adjusted burner could smoke. A mechanism allowed to run down would leave the lens facing one direction instead of turning through its proper characteristic. The strongest part of the station was therefore also one of the most delicate. Keepers cleaned the prisms with soft cloths and approved materials, watching for chips, loose fittings, and traces of smoke. Brass was kept clean, but not at the expense of the glass beside it. The lamp, lens, pedestal, and clockwork were separate pieces of equipment, yet each depended on the others. A clear lens around a weak flame was not enough. A bright lamp behind dirty prisms was not enough. A polished optic that failed to turn could give the wrong signal. The recognizable beam came from the whole arrangement working together. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Stand, for a moment, inside the lantern room before the lamp is lit. Evening lies blue beyond the windows. In the center is one small mantle, surrounded by rings of clear glass. When the flame appears, its light enters the prisms, bends through one careful angle after another, and leaves the tower as a narrow white path across the lake. The working night began in daylight. A keeper could not wait for darkness to discover that the lamp smoked, the fuel ran low, or the clockwork needed attention. The hours before sunset belonged to preparation, when the lantern room was bright enough to inspect, and there was still time to correct a fault before the signal was due. The exact routine changed with the station and its equipment. An older wick lamp required different handling from an incandescent oil vapor burner. A fixed light did not need the winding mechanism of a revolving lens. Yet the general order remained familiar. Clean what had burned through the previous night, restore what had been consumed, test what would move, and leave the apparatus ready for its appointed hour. The work began with yesterday's residue. Burned wick ends could produce smoke and an uneven flame, so they were trimmed to a clean edge. Chimneys and lamp glass were wiped free of soot. Fresnel prisms were cleaned carefully, one section at a time, because fingerprints, dust, and smoke all stood between the flame and the horizon. Fuel came next. Oil had to be carried into storage before it could be measured into a lamp. Kerosene for a vapor burner was poured into its tank, and the fittings were checked for leaks. At Split Rock, the fuel assembly needed hand pressure to send kerosene through the burner. The keeper prepared the system in the afternoon, knowing that pressure would also have to be renewed during the night. Consumable supplies required their own quiet accounting. Spare wicks, mantles, matches, cleaning cloths, lubricants, and lamp tools had to be present before they were needed. A broken mantle after dark was a small object with a large consequence. The sensible time to discover that the last replacement had been used was while another shipment could still be requested, not while the light was due. Then came the machinery. The clockwork cable was wound, lifting its column of disc weights. Gears, bearings, and the governor were inspected. A keeper could start the mechanism briefly to confirm that the lens moved freely, then stop it in position until lighting time. Tools stayed nearby, arranged for use rather than display. The lantern windows required attention of their own. Salt was not the problem on a freshwater lake, but spray, insects, dust, condensation, and weather still marked the glass. Snow and ice could obscure exposed panes in colder months. Clear windows mattered because even a perfect lens could not send a clean beam through a dirty lantern. Preparation continued outside the tower. The station boat needed to remain serviceable. Paths and stairs had to be safe. Buildings required paint, roofs required repair, and vegetation could not be allowed to hide the light from approaching vessels. At Raspberry Island, the May 1915 log records a succession of washing, cleaning, mowing, and painting. Dwelling walls, outbuildings, the boathouse, fog signal trim, dock railing, lantern, and veranda floors. None of it sounded grand. Together, it kept the station usable. Daylight also allowed work to be divided. One person could remain with the apparatus, while another carried fuel, repaired a landing, or handled the grounds. At family stations, household work proceeded beside federal work, sharing the same water supply, boat, weather, and limited hours of clear light. The government expected order. Instructions covered the apparatus, emergency conduct, records, and even uniforms. Inspectors could arrive to examine the station, its supplies, and the condition of federal property. Cleanliness was therefore practical, professional, and visible evidence that the keeper had remained attentive. There was also a quieter reason for the routine. Repetition reduced uncertainty. Fuel stored in its place could be found in low light. A tool returned to the same hook did not require a search during fog. A clean burner behaved more predictably than a neglected one. The afternoon's ordinary order made the night less complicated. As sunset approached, the station shifted from maintenance to operation. The keeper checked the official lighting time, which changed with season and location. The lamp was lit early enough to settle into a steady burn. The lens began to turn if the station's characteristic required it. From outside, the lantern room changed from a glass enclosure at the top of a tower into a bright, repeating signal. The moment could be beautiful, but beauty was not the test. The test was whether the light appeared on time, at the right brightness, with the right pattern. A sailor several miles away needed the result, not the ceremony. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. A soft cleaning cloth passes across one prism, then the next. Brass fittings catch the last daylight. The clockwork weights wait high inside the tower. On a shelf, the logbook lies open to a fresh line. Everything is ready before the first shadow reaches the water. Once the light was burning, the keeper's work became a matter of intervals. There was the interval between flashes, the interval before the clockwork needed winding, the interval between checks on the lamp, and the longer measure from sunset to dawn. A night at a lighthouse was not one continuous emergency. It was a sequence of small obligations that returned before they could be forgotten. At stations with several keepers, the watches could be divided. A principal keeper and assistants shared the hours according to local practice and the needs of the equipment. At a station with one keeper, the same person carried more of the night alone. Autumn brought longer darkness, and a revolving apparatus that needed frequent winding made those hours especially demanding. The watch began with observation. The lamp had to burn evenly. A wick flame could change shape as fuel moved and the charred edge developed. An oil vapor system needed sufficient pressure. Smoke inside the chimney warned that combustion was wrong and that soot might begin gathering on the glass. The keeper watched the flame not for comfort, but for evidence. At Split Rock, the lens mechanism required winding about every 2 hours. The weights that had been raised before sunset descended inside the tower while the gears turned above. Before they reached the bottom, the keeper used the hand crank to lift them again. The machinery could then resume the same slow exchange, height becoming motion, motion becoming a flash on the lake. Between checks, there were quieter stretches. The keeper might sit in the service room below the lantern, close enough to hear a change in the mechanism. Gears had a familiar sound when they ran correctly. A pump handle had a familiar resistance. The rotating lens sent regular changes of brightness across the walls. An irregular sound or a delayed flash could call the keeper back to the apparatus before a complete failure occurred. Weather entered the watch as both condition and record. Wind direction, visibility, rain, snow, temperature, and the state of the lake affected the station's work. Fog might require a second system to be started. Severe weather could extend the hours of operation. A clear, calm night asked less of the machinery, but it was still entered into the log. During a severe storm, instructions could require the light to remain operating through hours when it would normally have been extinguished. That extended the same practical needs rather than changing them. More fuel, more winding, more observation, and a later opportunity to clean the apparatus. Reliability came from continuing the routine beyond its usual boundary. Those logs preserved the life of the station in compact lines. They recorded maintenance, supplies, vessels, visitors, and unusual events, but many entries were plain. The light was exhibited. The weather changed. Painting continued. A tender arrived or did not. The brevity was part of their value. The keeper was not writing a memoir each night. He was leaving an official account that another employee or inspector could understand. For a passing ship, the station's characteristic remained the central fact. Split Rock's 2 lens faces produced a brief flash every 10 seconds. At Passage Island, the signal changed over time from fixed red to flashing white. A keeper on watch was protecting that identity. If a revolving light stopped and became fixed, the lamp might still be bright, but the message had changed. The night also reached into the house below. A spouse might tend the lamp while the appointed keeper was ill or briefly away. Children learned that the tower's hours did not follow household convenience. Supper and sleep fitted around the signal because the signal could not be asked to wait. This did not mean every keeper stood awake beside the lens until morning. Staffing and apparatus allowed rest in different ways. It meant that responsibility continued through the dark. Someone had to be able to hear the machinery, wake for the next winding, respond to fog, and notice when the expected rhythm changed. Near dawn, the final interval arrived. The horizon lightened, the beam became less useful, and the official schedule allowed the lamp to be extinguished. The night's fuel could be measured by what remained. The apparatus was stopped. Then cleaning and preparation began again, because the end of one watch was also the start of the next cycle. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. In the tower's central mast, a stack of round iron weights descends through darkness. Above it, gears turn with a soft, even sound. Far outside, the beam passes over the lake, disappears, and returns. Before the weights reach the floor, a hand finds the crank and patiently lifts them back toward the top. A lighthouse beam depended on a clear path through the air. Fog removed that pass. The lamp could be bright, the lens clean, and the clockwork exact, yet a vessel beyond the white curtain might see none of it. The station therefore needed another way to announce its position, one that traveled as vibration rather than light. Early fog signals took many forms. Bells and gongs could be struck by hand or machinery. Steam whistles sent sound farther, but required boilers, fuel, water, and time to raise pressure. Later sirens and diaphones used compressed air. Each device had its own voice and repeating pattern, giving mariners an audible characteristic to compare with their charts and light lists. Sound on water was not perfectly dependable. Wind, temperature, distance, and the shape of the shore could change how it carried. A signal might seem near, then faint, or arrive from a direction made uncertain by fog. It did not replace careful navigation. It gave a vessel one more measured fact when the visible coast had disappeared. Unlike the beam, sound offered no sharp line to follow. It spread, reflected, weakened, and sometimes passed over one patch of water more clearly than another. The keeper could maintain the prescribed sequence, but could not stand inside the signal building and know exactly how it was being heard several miles away. At Split Rock, keepers were instructed to operate the fog signal when visibility fell below roughly 5 miles. The signal building stood apart from the tower because its machinery belonged to a different system. Inside were engines, compressors, tanks, pipes, valves, tools, fuel, and the signal itself. What sounded from the lake like one low note began ashore as a room full of moving equipment. From 1910 through 1931, gasoline engines powered Split Rock's air compressors. Diesel compressors followed in 1932. The station used a siren through 1935, then a Type F diaphone beginning in 1936. The diaphone had developed from the principle of an organ stop. Compressed air moved a slotted piston, producing a forceful low-frequency tone with a distinctive ending. Split Rock sequence was simple to describe, a 2-second blast followed by 18 seconds of silence. Then the cycle began again. From a ship, the interval helped identify the station. From inside the signal building, it divided time into short bursts of sound and longer periods in which engines and compressors continued their work. Fog duty could begin at any hour and continue as long as visibility remained below the required distance. The machinery needed starting, monitoring, lubrication, and fuel. Compressors created heat and vibration. Engines introduced more surfaces to clean and more parts that could fail. A long fog did not add one task to the keeper's day. It opened a second watch beside the first. The light still had to operate. Clockwork still needed winding. Lamp pressure still needed checking. Logs still needed entries. At a well-staffed station, duties could be divided between tower and signal building. At a smaller station, fog compressed sleep and household time because the same limited number of people now had 2 navigational aids to maintain. Fog also changed the station grounds. The tower might vanish from the house a short walk away. Moisture settled on railings and windows. A boat at the landing became sound before it became shape. Ordinary distances felt larger because the next building appeared only after someone had nearly reached it. Yet the signal itself was built from repetition. 2 seconds of sound, 18 seconds without it. The pattern continued, not hurried by the fact that no one ashore could see the vessel listening. As with the beam, reliability meant performing the expected action for strangers who might pass without ever knowing the keeper's name. By the middle of the 20th century, radio, radar, improved shipboard navigation, and automated aids changed the role of shore fog signals. Split rocks was discontinued in 1961, while its light continued. The building and machinery remained as evidence that keeping a lighthouse had once required far more than tending a lamp. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Fog presses against the signal building windows until the lake and sky become one pale surface. The compressor settles into its rhythm. A valve opens. For 2 seconds, a deep note moves outward through the white air. Then there are 18 seconds of quiet before the station speaks again. A light station could be federal property and a family home at the same time. The government supplied buildings for an official purpose: a tower, quarters, storage, perhaps a fog signal and boathouse. The people assigned there supplied the rest of daily life. They cooked in the kitchen, dried clothing, carried water, planted gardens, taught children, repaired furniture, and learned which windows rattled when the wind changed. Staffing shaped the household. A principal keeper might live beside 1 or 2 assistants and their families. At O'Sable, the station eventually included space for a head keeper and 2 assistant keepers, with 2 families occupying separate levels of the older dwelling. At Raspberry Island, the house was rebuilt as a duplex after the fog signal increased the need for staff. Rank entered domestic space in practical ways. The principal keeper carried formal responsibility for the station, while assistants took assigned watches and maintenance. Separate quarters offered some privacy, but walls did not separate families from the same fog horn, landing, water supply, or duty schedule. Cooperation and friction both had room to grow in a small clearing. Other stations could be much smaller. When an assistant position disappeared, one keeper might be left with a revolving apparatus and long autumn nights. Family help then became part of the practical system, whether or not an appointment paper acknowledged it. Many keepers' wives learned to light lamps, tend burners, and watch the apparatus. Their knowledge allowed an appointed keeper to leave briefly, respond elsewhere, or recover from illness. Some women received official positions and pay. In the Apostle Islands, Ella Lewick served at Sand Island, Mary Snow at Raspberry Island, and Matilda Rumrill at Michigan Island as recognized assistants. Their appointments make visible a much larger body of work that records did not always name. Children also lived within the station's schedule. School could divide a family by season. Some children stayed on an island until classes resumed, then returned to the mainland while a parent remained at the light. Families sometimes maintained two homes, with the expense and labor that required. A supply trip, medical need, or visit to relatives began with the uncertain availability of a boat. On Menagerie Island near Isle Royale, keeper John Henry Malone and his wife raised a large family during more than 3 decades of navigation seasons. As many as 11 children shared the narrow island at different times. The family kept cows, fished, gathered what the place could provide, and coaxed a garden from shallow soil. Several learned musical instruments. They also recorded bird observations for the Audubon Society. Those details keep isolation from becoming an empty word. A remote household was not silent. It contained lessons, meals, arguments, chores, music, and children finding uses for a small outdoor space. It also depended on labor. Animals needed care, water and fuel had to be carried, food had to last between deliveries. A garden was both pleasure and practical reserve. Station grounds often carried the household's mark. Vegetable plots, flowers, orchard trees, livestock areas, paths, and laundry lines occupied the clearing around the official buildings. Elizabeth Lane, whose husband kept Michigan Island for decades, became known for the flowers she cultivated there. The same cleared land that allowed the tower to remain visible also made room for domestic life. Not everyone remembered that life fondly. Cecilia McLean, who lived at several Lake Superior stations during her husband's career, later spoke plainly about loneliness, difficult small boat travel, deep snow, and the burden of keeping 2 homes. Her husband said that he liked lighthouse work. Their different memories belonged to the same marriage and the same stations. That difference is worth keeping. Lighthouse life was neither a permanent holiday nor one unbroken hardship. A family could value the landscape, take pride in the light, and still resent the distance and restriction. One person could find purposeful work where another found a world narrowed by someone else's appointment. The official log usually centered on weather and station duty. It might note an arrival, a departure, or work on the dwelling. Much of the household remained outside its short lines. Meals left no characteristic on the lake. A washed floor did not appear in a light list. Yet the keepers who wound the mechanism and sounded the fog signal depended on that quieter structure around them. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Near the tower, a narrow garden has been cleared from thin island soil. Beans climb a simple frame. A few flowers lean toward the afternoon light. From an open window comes the sound of someone practicing the same musical phrase again, while above the roof, the lantern waits for evening. Winter did not arrive at every Lake Superior light station in the same way. Some stations operated mainly with the navigation season. Around Isle Royale, keepers commonly served from late April into November, while commercial traffic could still move through the lake. When shipping withdrew and ice complicated access, crews returned to the mainland. Other lights, especially those near communities or needed for local routes, followed different schedules. Later Coast Guard practice changed them again. The phrase closed season can therefore mislead. It did not mean that the tower ceased to exist until spring. It meant that a working system had to be placed into a condition that could survive months of cold, wind, snow, moisture, and absence. An empty building still met the weather. Snow loaded roofs. Freeze and thaw opened small gaps. Moisture entered wood and masonry. Metal cooled, contracted, and waited for spring inspection. Closing a station well meant anticipating damage that no one would be present to correct immediately. Before departure, supplies were counted and equipment secured. Fuel had to be stored safely. Lamps and lenses were cleaned. Machinery could be protected from corrosion, and anything damaged during the season had to be repaired or reported. Boats were hauled up. Openings were fastened. Buildings were left ready to resist, whether without a keeper close enough to hear the first loose shutter. This work depended on the Lighthouse service tender system. Tenders carried fuel, replacement equipment, building materials, mail, and provisions to stations that roads did not reach. They also carried inspectors and repair crews. Their visits linked one isolated household to district offices, depots, and other lights. Near the end of navigation season, the expected tender was transportation, supply line, and calendar at once. Timing mattered. A crew could not wait indefinitely for the last comfortable day. The departure boat had to reach the station, load people and baggage, and return before worsening weather or early ice closed the route. The same lake that made a light necessary also controlled when a remote station could be supplied or emptied. At Split Rock in its early years, the station shut down annually in December. Keepers' families often left earlier when school resumed, and the keepers joined them when the light was taken out of service for winter. Before the North Shore Highway reached the station in 1924, nearly everything and everyone arrived by water. The closed season changed after road access made year-round family residence more practical. On the most exposed islands, the last weeks could reduce ordinary choices. Supplies that seemed generous in summer acquired a different meaning when the tender was delayed. At Rock of Ages near Isle Royale, one late-season crew was remembered as reaching its final can of tomatoes before being taken off for winter. The detail is small enough to feel true to station life. Not a feast, not a crisis invented for effect, just a shelf nearly empty while people waited for transport. For families who maintained a mainland home, the move itself created work. Bedding, clothing, school needs, keepsakes, and children crossed between households. Some possessions remained at the station. Others could not be risked through a damp, unheated winter. Cecilia McLean later described the strain of maintaining two homes and the necessities that had to be slighted. Winter on the mainland was not necessarily rest. Keepers might take leave, receive reassignment, prepare for the next season, or live near the station while the light was inactive. At Split Rock, families eventually stayed through the layoff, and children traveled to school by bus. Snow replaced water as the daily obstacle, drifting across roads and paths that summer visitors later took for granted. Spring reversed the process. Crews returned with provisions and replacement parts. Buildings were opened and inspected for damage. Damp rooms were aired. Boats and machinery went back into service. The lamp, lens, and fog signal had to be ready before vessels again expected to find them. The season began then with more than lighting a wick. It required restoring an inhabited station around the light. Water, fuel, food, tools, records, and people all returned to their places. The federal signal and the household woke together. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. At the landing, a wooden crate waits beside folded blankets and a keeper's sea bag. Its contents have been listed in pencil before the lid is nailed down. Behind it, the lantern is clean and dark. Ahead, the last boat of the season moves slowly toward the dock. The keeper's first duty was to prevent trouble at a distance. A correctly shown light, an operating fog signal, and an accurate record served vessels the keeper might never meet. Most nights ended without a boat at the landing or a name added to the log. Navigation succeeded quietly through courses altered before danger became immediate. But a station could not remain separate from events on the water. Keepers watched weather and traffic from places chosen precisely because they overlooked difficult routes. They might see a distress signal, hear a whistle repeated out of pattern, receive a message, or find people arriving at the station in need of shelter and assistance. Lighthouse instructions included a duty to aid people from wrecked vessels when possible. That did not turn every keeper into a member of a trained rescue crew. During much of the Lighthouse era, the United States Life-Saving Service was a separate organization. Its stations maintained surf boats, specialized equipment, drills, and crews whose central purpose was rescue. On the Great Lakes, dedicated life-saving stations expanded during the late 19th century, sometimes near or beside lighthouses. The two services could cooperate, but their primary work was different. A lighthouse keeper maintained an aid to navigation. A life-saving crew practiced launching boats, reaching vessels, and bringing people ashore. In 1915, the life-saving service joined with the revenue cutter service to form the Coast Guard. The lighthouse service remained separate until 1939. Administrative lines were clear on paper. A cold person at the station door made them less important. Keepers used the boats, lines, signals, tools, and local knowledge available to them. They could pass information to a life-saving station, guide a responding vessel, care for survivors, or assist a crew working nearby. The proper action depended on weather, distance, staffing, and what could be done without abandoning the light itself. Readiness did not require reckless action. A small station boat could not safely answer every vessel in heavy weather, and leaving shore could create another emergency. The keeper had to judge what assistance was possible, use signals when direct help was not, and preserve the station's ability to guide other traffic through the same conditions. That final condition mattered. A keeper who left the station might remove the only person able to tend its lamp and characteristic. At Raspberry Island in 1887, keeper Francis Jacker was driven to another island while trying to protect the station boat. His family managed to relight the lamp during his absence, but could not set the revolving machinery in motion. Mariners noticed that the expected signal was wrong. The episode eventually helped demonstrate why the station needed an assistant. It was a practical lesson rather than a simple tale of failure. One person, one boat, one revolving lens, and one exposed station left no margin when duties collided. Adding an assistant did more than divide routine labor. It allowed the light to continue while someone handled the unexpected. Much of the keeper's service remained smaller than rescue. A station boat carried mail or a message. A signal flag communicated with a passing tender, whether information entered the log. A landing was kept usable. A traveler received directions or shelter. Federal property and household supplies could become useful to someone whose own boat had been delayed. Keepers also protected the public from the station itself. Cliffs, machinery, fuel, stairs, and lantern galleries were working spaces. As roads brought more visitors to Split Rock, keepers had to manage people arriving to see what had once been remote. Safety fences appeared along the cliff, and the station's private routine acquired an audience. The work therefore reached in two directions. Outward, the light and fog signals served vessels beyond the shore. Inward, the keeper maintained a place capable of responding when distance closed and strangers arrived. Neither required the keeper to seek danger. Both required readiness. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Beside the station boat, a dry line has been coiled in a clean circle. It may remain there through the night. That is the preferred result. But it is ready, its end easy to find, because ordinary service includes preparing carefully for work that may never be needed. Electricity reached Lighthouse work one station at a time. There was no single night when every oil lamp on Lake Superior went dark and every electric bulb came on. Power lines, generators, new motors, replacement optics, and local need arrived on different schedules. The old systems and the new overlapped for decades. Where electricity became dependable, it removed several repeated tasks. A bulb did not need a wick trimmed or a kerosene tank pumped. An electric motor could turn a lens without a falling weight that required winding. Compressors no longer needed the same engines and fuel. Fewer consumables had to be carried up the tower. New equipment introduced different points of failure. Bulbs burned out. Motors, wiring, generators, and controls needed inspection. A station distant from an electrical line required its own source of power. Keepers carried fewer cans of kerosene up the stairs, but they did not become unnecessary the instant the first wire entered the building. At Split Rock, electrification came in 1940. A 1,000-watt bulb replaced the incandescent oil vapor lamp. Electric motors operated the lens and fog signal. The Great Fresnel optic remained, as did its 10-second characteristic, but the work supporting it changed. The keeper no longer raised clockwork weights every 2 hours or maintained pressure in a kerosene tank through the night. The year before, the institution around the light had changed as well. On July 1, 1939, the Bureau of Lighthouses was transferred from the Department of Commerce and consolidated with the Coast Guard. The national system included roughly 30,000 aides to navigation and more than 5,000 employees, among them over 1,100 light keepers and assistants. Civilian lighthouse traditions did not disappear at once. Buildings, lenses, routes, and many experienced employees remained, but uniforms, ranks, assignments, records, and lines of authority gradually became Coast Guard matters. Some civilian personnel entered the new service. At other stations, Coast Guard crews replaced the households that had lived beside the tower. Electrification made automation easier, but they were not the same thing. A station could use electric equipment and remain staffed. Full automation meant that the aid could perform its normal signal without a resident keeper, with maintenance crews visiting as needed. Reliable controls, compact lamps, improved power, and later solar equipment reduced the reason for a family to live at the site. The dates again belonged to individual stations. Raspberry Island was automated in 1947. Osable remained staffed until 1958, when the Coast Guard left and the light became fully automatic. Passage Island retained people much later and was fully automated in 1978. Split Rock was decommissioned in 1969 as navigation technology and routes changed around it. Automation gained efficiency. A light could operate without salaries, quarters, deliveries, and night watches organized around one apparatus. Smaller modern optics required less power. Maintenance teams could care for many aids rather than living beside one. Station architecture recorded the reduction. A house designed for several families became more space than an automated light required. Oil rooms lost their original purpose. Fog signal buildings stood quiet when their machinery was removed or discontinued. The tower could continue working while much of the surrounding station became surplus property in need of a new use. Something was also removed from the station. The garden no longer supported a keeper's household. The log no longer recorded every quiet day from an occupied house. A malfunction became a reason for a crew to travel out, rather than a sound noticed through the wall by someone already there. The beam remained a public promise, but the human presence behind it moved farther away. This was not neglect. Automated aids still required inspection, repair, power, records, and replacement. The work became less continuous at one location and more distributed across a network. A Coast Guard technician arriving by boat belonged to the same long history of maintenance as a keeper carrying kerosene up the stairs, even though the tools and schedule were different. Here is the detail to carry with you into sleep. Inside the lens at Split Rock, a clear electric bulb stands where the pressurized kerosene burner once produced its flame. The glass prisms around it have not changed. Current reaches a filament, a motor begins to turn, and the old beam crosses the lake with a new source at its center. Many Lake Superior light stations outlived the households built to keep them. Some towers still carry active aids to navigation. Their modern lights are smaller, more efficient, and easier to maintain than the lamps that preceded them. Other stations were decommissioned and became historic places. In both cases, the work continued. A building exposed to the lake does not preserve itself any more than a lighthouse once kept itself. At Raspberry Island, more than a century of weather-damaged foundations, walls, roofs, and the shoreline below the station. The National Park Service stabilized the site and restored the keeper's quarters to help visitors understand the household that had occupied it. Gardens, paths, the boathouse, and the clearing remained part of the story because the light had never been only a tower. O'Sable's modern solar-powered light now shines from the railing outside the old lantern. The original third-order lens is gone, but the station buildings preserve the arrangement of principal keeper, assistants, fuel, fog signal, and home. Passage Island's automated light continues to mark the narrow route near Isle Royale. The signal still performs its old geographic duty without a resident family below it. At Split Rock, the lens remains one of the clearest ways to see the keeper's system whole. The third-order optic, brass framework, clockwork, lamp equipment, fog signal machinery, houses, and service buildings can be read together. One component explains another. The beam required the lens required motion. Motion required power. Power required a keeper, supplies, buildings, and a route by which all of them could arrive. Preservation adds a new kind of keeper. Historians organize logs. Conservators protect glass and metal. Carpenters repair windows. Grounds crews hold back vegetation and water. Rangers explain why a duplex stood beside a tower. Volunteers tend gardens that no longer feed a station family, but still show how people made a remote federal site into a home. Saving only the tower would preserve the symbol and lose much of the explanation. The dwelling, oil house, signal building, landing, paths, and clearings show how many separate forms of work supported the light above them. The surviving logs are modest records for such a large inheritance. They note weather, painting, cleaning, supplies, visitors, and the exhibition of the light. Read together, their repetition becomes the point. Reliability was built from days that looked much like one another. Tonight, we began with a flash scene from far out on the lake. From that distance, the tower appeared to do one simple thing. We have since followed the beam backward, through lantern glass and Fresnel prisms, into the stationary flame, down through the pedestal to gears, cable, and descending weights, across the grounds to fuel storage and the fog signal building, into the logbook, the kitchen, the garden, the station boat, and the crate waiting for the last tender of the season. The light did not keep itself, neither does its memory. Both depend on people returning to small tasks, cleaning a prism, labeling a photograph, repairing a roof, winding a mechanism for a demonstration, checking a modern beacon after winter, or reading one more quiet line from a keeper's log. Outside the archive, Lake Superior has gone dark again. Somewhere along its shore, a compact light turns on without ceremony. It crosses water that looks empty, reaches a vessel whose name the station does not know, and returns after its measured interval. Here is the last detail to carry with you. In a preserved lantern room, the lens begins to turn. Evening light passes through its glass before the lamp inside is bright enough to notice. For a moment, the prisms hold the window, the lake, and the room together. Then the beam moves on, and the machinery continues its patient circle. That's where I'll close the file for tonight. The archive will be here tomorrow. It always is. Sleep well.